You can build a composition around one dominant visual using size, shape, color, pattern, or value contrast, where all the other graphic elements form relationships with that dominant visual. A dominant composition can be based on one major movement, gesture, or compositional thrust, with all other movements minor ones, built in relation to it through optical decisions and adjustments. Or you can build a composition where there is no one overtly dominant visual. Relationships are built through sequence, pattern, grid, modular structure, repetition, stair structure, axis alignment, edge alignment, positioning, and flow, or some other unifying principle. No graphic element dominates. This structure concept applies to single surfaces, multiple surfaces, and motion graphics. You can build a static composition or one that suggests motion or movement. A static composition represents a fixed position. It doesn't move, and it doesn't imply motion. The illusion of motion can be created by a variety of means. For example, through receding diagonals, or through a kinetic-looking figure by capturing an archetypal movement, or by an angle, point of view, or large shifts in scale. A visual sequence is a number of items, graphic elements, or events in an order that might imply the passage of time, intervals, or motion over a period of time. A sequence can be established on a single surface, on sequential pages, or in motion graphics. Sequential arrangements have a discernible specific order to form a particular sequence. One graphic element or frame can seem to be the consequence or result of the previous element or frame. Sequential elements can also denote the illusion of motion through visual multiplication. Multiple positions, like a comic book rendering, blurred boundaries or edges, repetition, shifts, or layers contribute to the illusion of movement. In visual perception, theoretically, a viewer associates a psychological tension with the position of visual elements in the composition. Accordingly, viewers feel confused if the position of a visual element is ambiguous, if the positioning seems tentative. People prefer positioning that produces stability and certainty. As an example, if you position a dark circle slightly off-center, as if it had migrated from the center and should be returned to it. Therefore, if you position an element off-center, make sure it looks off-center, not out of kilter. If you want a line quality to look scratchy, make it really scratchy. If you want it to feel tall, make sure it's very tall. Rule of thumb, avoid tentativeness and make your intentions clear. And have you meant it? To ensure your arrangement is deliberate and each graphic component is thoughtfully and deliberately positioned, consider employing these 4 reminders, which will aid awareness of how you position graphic elements in relation to the format. Here, the word relate means having some bearing to. It doesn't mean graphic elements need to literally touch the midline or edges. M equals midline. Consider all your graphic components in relation to the format's midline. 2. E. Edges. Consider all graphic elements in response to the format's edges. 3. N, or negative shapes and space. Consider all of your negative space. And 4. T. Transitions. Consider all transitions among graphic elements. Graphic design isn't just about making things look nice. It's about understanding the mechanics and processes that make up the user experience. By learning how people interact with what they see, we can adjust our designs to enhance the quality of the final experience. One fundamental aspect of this experience is how people actually read pages. And once we know how the eye interacts with visual stimuli, we can manipulate that to be more visually appealing. First of all, let's take a very brief look at how our eyes work when we read. There's 4 main types of eye movement: pursuit, vergence, vestibular, and saccadic. Saccadic is the most important when it comes to reading. Saccadic eye movements are the rapid movements of our eyes when we're exploring a visual scene. Generally speaking, saccades usually last around 20 to 200 milliseconds. Between each saccade is what's known as fixation, which is when our eyes are still. This lasts around 200 to 300 milliseconds. When it comes to reading, we rely so heavily on this because they bring objects into the center of our perception. This is important because the center of our visual field is highly accurate, and the further away from the center you go, the less accurate your vision becomes. By rapidly moving our eyes over a body of text, we allow ourselves to directly perceive and therefore process more information. The average saccade size is apparently 7 to 9 letter spaces, and that is going to depend on the font size and type style you're using. Luckily for us designers, science not only helps with the how of reading, but also what. As it turns out, the majority of people follow certain patterns when it comes to how they direct their attention. For cultures that read from left to right, there are two major types of reading patterns. They are the F pattern and the Z pattern. F patterns apply to traditional pages, which tend to be more text-heavy, and these include things like blog posts and articles. In the F pattern, a reader will scan down the left-hand side of the page, searching for key information, and once something of interest has been identified, the reader will typically stop and begin reading from left to right in order to acquire more information. Z patterns are used for other types of content, typically adverts or website home pages where there's less text. The eye moves from left to right across the top of the page, skips down to the bottom left corner, and again scans to the right. Z pattern eye movements are the reason why you'll often find web pages laid out in a similar way, with a lot of important information placed along the top and the bottom of the page. It seems that when we look at something, we're naturally drawn to its biggest and most standout element. So in advertising, when somebody looks at a design, whether it's a poster or a web page, their eyes will almost always be drawn to the biggest thing first. That may seem like an obvious point, but it's worth mentioning because when you keep this rule in mind, you have an incredibly simple but effective tool at your disposal for directing attention. Whatever you want the reader to read first, make it bigger. Another obvious but important point to cover is the fact that, as well as size, our eyes are also drawn to color. Bright colors are more attention-grabbing than muted colors. They stand out more against black and white, so vibrant colors can be visually commanding, but use them sparingly. We've talked about the importance of negative space before. You can be almost certain that anyone who glances at a page that has a single red dot in the center is going to look at the red dot first. Empty space draws attention by diverting it. Where there's empty space, there's nothing. When you look at a poster, you expect to see something, so naturally your eye will ignore the contents of the empty space and go straight to wherever the content is. Learning how people interact with design is a great way to deepen your knowledge and enhance your skill set.